Throughout our lives, there are certain things that we learn, certain skills that we learn because someone took the time to sit down or step aside and invest a little time in us to learn those skills. When I was a little boy, I learned to tie a tie. And I did it like many of you. My dad basically put his hands around me and tied it. I don't know, guys, if you've ever tried to tie a tie opposite. Looking at it, it's really hard. So you kind of have to get your arms around. And my dad showed me how to tie a tie. The knot he showed me is called a full Windsor. It uses a lot of ties, so I have to have long ties. But that's how I learned. He took some time, invested in me. Anything I know, which is not a ton, but I know enough about working on an automobile to get by okay and save myself quite a bit of money. And those things I learned because my dad took some time on Saturday afternoons and got out there and made me fix the car and sat there right along with me. How many of you learned anything you know about working on a car, that's the way you learned it? Someone just sat down beside you, maybe a dad, an uncle, a neighbor, whatever. I remember when I was a little boy, and at this point we were living in southern Indiana. It's funny the things that you remember. Because there are a lot of things that I should remember that I don't. But then some things that just hit my mind, I'm like, where did that come from? Why do I remember that? But I remember as a little boy, I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I remember my mom taught me, it was for a class for school, but she taught me how to make chocolate chip cookies. That changed my life. Pastor Michael, when I figured I could make my own, law help. I didn't have to wait on somebody else to make them. Someone came alongside me and showed me. And there are so many things in our lives like that. Someone simply took a little bit of time to sit down and walk us through something, invested in us. When I went to college, as my freshman year, I had just turned 18 years old. I had just gotten saved. And I became aware that year that God wanted me to be involved in some kind of ministry. And the campus minister of the Georgia Southern Baptist Student Union, my sophomore year, was a gentleman named Gary Johnson. I was just 18, about to turn 19. And Gary began to find me opportunities to preach all around Statesboro, Georgia, in all kinds of little towns and cities and churches. And when he had the opportunity, I would sometimes speak at the Baptist Student Union meetings. And when he had the opportunity, he would sit in the back while I was speaking with a legal pad. And I'll never forget the first time this happened. I spoke at the Baptist Student Union, and this was on a Tuesday night because that's when our meetings were. And on Wednesday morning, he called me and he said, hey, do you have some time to go to lunch today? Do you have lunch plans? I said, no, not really. So I'll meet you at the cafeteria. My lunch plans were to go to the cafeteria and use my meal plan, right? So that was lunch plan. And so we sat down together, and he pulls out this legal pad, and it was filled, the first page, and 3/4 of the way, the second page. And he sat there, he said, I just wanted to share a few of the things that I noticed while you were speaking. And he began to walk through. You said 46 times. You stumbled, and this point was not really clear. I thought he was going to tell me what a great job I did. God bless him. Gary's still a very, very dear friend, and we're still prayer partners today. I can tell you there are a few things in my life in terms of preaching and speaking that have maybe helped me more than he just sat down with me and came alongside me and began to point out things. And so there are so many things in our lives that are like that. Well, in the Church of Jesus Christ, we have at times called discipleship, or we say discipleship, and we think of it as a class or a program or a set of materials. Discipleship materials. When I was younger, churches had on Sunday night usually what they called discipleship training. That was very common in Baptist churches. And certainly going through classes, going through courses, going through materials can help in discipleship. When I first got saved, here was my discipleship. I went to church. I went to church, I got involved in Sunday school, and every time I had an opportunity to hear God's Word taught and stuff, I was there and present, and that helped me to grow, and that was kind of my discipleship. But I also had some people who came alongside me. But unfortunately in the church at times, if we're not careful, we think we can chalk discipleship up to some classes. And so then I hear this from time to time. people will say, Pastor, oftentimes our church is good at evangelism but not good at discipleship. And I don't really know what that means, to be honest with you. Maybe they're talking about we don't offer enough classes. Maybe they're talking about we don't offer enough courses or enough materials. I got to tell you, this is not a boast. There are plenty of opportunities for God's Word being taught weekly at Green Acres Baptist Church that if you want to, you can grow. So let me just say that. There are plenty of opportunities. But here's what I think has been the error at times. We have chalked discipleship up at times to simply classes or simply courses or simply materials, and it is far more than that. In fact, I'm convinced discipleship is as much about taking one Christian who's a little bit farther along than another Christian, and the Christian who's a little farther along than the other, just investing their time and attention in that other believer. Maybe that one Christian is not that much farther along than another, but that's okay, because they just take some time to invest. You've heard me, as I've preached, talk about personal evangelism, right? One person telling another lost person how to know Christ as their Savior. And that's something all Christians, if you're born again, you're going to be involved in. I'm not telling you ought to. I'm just telling you will if you're truly born again. I'm not commanding you to do it, because if you're truly born again, you will. But there's also, I'm convinced, this aspect of personal discipleship. That is, much like personal evangelism, it is just me caring more about people around me than I do myself. So then I'm trying to find opportunities to invest what I know or what I've experienced or what I've learned in someone else who may be not quite as far along as me. You say, Pastor, well, I'm kind of young. I'm not really sure I can do that. This is not about how young you are. Pastor, I'm so old I can't get out much. This is not about how old you are. I'm telling you, every single born-again believer in this place has someone that they can turn to and invest in a way that we're going to call personal discipleship. This morning, I want to talk to you a little bit about the immense impact of personal discipleship. Here's our primary thought. You ready? The potential impact of properly and thoroughly discipling someone is immense. The potential impact of properly discipling someone can be immense. My dear brother Gary Johnson, when he sat down with me in that cafeteria and began to help me learn how to preach and began to help me learn what it meant to be a pastor, and more than that, he helped me learn what it meant to be a husband. He has a greater impact. He has had a greater impact in my life on being a husband and a father than any other single experience in my life. How could he possibly know in that moment where I would be, where I would go, what I would do? And so in one sense, every person that I help disciple in this church, he has helped disciple because he discipled me. And every time you invest your life in another person, when that person then, with Christ, and when that person goes on to minister to others, in one sense, you're ministering to others as well. There is immense potential in personal discipleship. And today, I want to talk about a few essentials to remember in personal discipleship, a few essentials to remember. And to do that, we're going to use a story. It is a story of a couple and a guy. A born-again couple and a guy who was sort of born again and would be fully born again by the end of the story. And so here's what's happening. We're in the book of Acts still, Adventures in Acts. The Apostle Paul has made his way in his second missionary journey all the way to Corinth. And some of you may remember, Jason, do we have that map up there? Just brush through this quickly. Paul has taken his, do we have the other one? Has like Thessalonica and Philippi and all those. Okay. If you come up with that, shoot it up there. If not, no worries. Some of you may remember that Paul in the second missionary journey hit in a region called Macedonia. Macedonia, as Paul got there, he docked in a port called Neapolis, and he hit, watch my hand, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and then the far southernmost tip was an area called Achaia. There we go. This is Achaia, and it includes Corinth. So Philippi, he passed by these two, Amphipolis and Apollonia, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth. And by the time we reach Acts chapter 18, by the way, I don't think I told you to turn there. If you haven't already, you can turn to Acts chapter 18 in your Bibles or your tablets or your smartphones or wherever you might be looking at a copy of God's Word. I'm preaching from the New King James Version. By the time he got to the city of Corinth, which was a massive city at the time, it was an intimidating city. He spent about 18 months there, and then he left Corinth with a couple whom he had met named Aquila and Priscilla. And Aquila and Priscilla were tent makers, just as Paul was, and they became fast friends. And I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. Paul, a single older preacher, Priscilla and Aquila, a younger, probably younger married couple. Who would have thought they would be great friends? I think oftentimes we think our friendships in the church have to be with people who are in the same place in life as we are. And I want to suggest to you that that is not at all the case. You got the Apostle Paul, an older preacher at this point, and a younger married couple now traveling together, and they will head across the Mediterranean Sea, or the Aegean Sea, really. Here's the Mediterranean Sea, here's the Aegean Sea, and they'll head across over to Ephesus. We're familiar with Ephesus. There's a letter to the Ephesians in the New Testament that Paul writes. And Paul heads there. He goes on and does his deal, but he leaves Aquila and Priscilla in Ephesus. In fact, Paul leaves Ephesus and heads back to Antioch, by the way. And we're going to see here in just a moment how Paul will head out on his third missionary journey. So Paul leaves Ephesus, goes to Antioch, which is where he launched his ministry from, right? He launched his ministry from Antioch. He leaves Aquila and Priscilla in Ephesus. That's where we kind of pick up in Acts chapter 18. And I want to begin reading in verse 23, but watch this. Our study is going to be verses 24 through 28, all right? But I want to read verse 23. After that's Paul, had spent some time there, that is in Antioch. He's left Ephesus, gone to Antioch. He, that is Paul, departed and went over the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. Everybody see 18:23? Everybody see that? Nod your head. I see that. All right. Yeah. Okay. That is the beginning of the third missionary journey, by the way. Just a note. It's very subtle. No great big send-off or anything. It's very subtle. That's the beginning of the third missionary journey. So now you can forget that for the moment. Until next week we'll pick up. But for now, as we look at verses 24 through 28, 24 through 28 is what the story in this event is kind of like what was happening. Chronologically, it would have happened among the verses that are earlier in the chapter. It's kind of like we're coming to that. It says Paul's going on his third missionary journey, and oh yeah, here's a story I want to tell you about, Luke writes. Here's a few verses on a story I want to tell you about Aquila and Priscilla and Apollos and how they interact and come across each other. And so, verse 24, I'm going to read this whole thing. Now, a certain Jew named Apollos, that's a great name, by the way. That's kind of a strong, manly name. I don't know. That was an observation. That doesn't really have anything to do with the study. It hit me. Apollos is a really strong name. Anyway, apparently nobody else thinks so, but that's all right. But I do. I'm going to keep thinking it. Brother Ed, is that? Okay. Now, a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So we're just getting to meet this guy named Apollos. And remember, Paul left Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus. Verse 26, so he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he desired to cross into Achaia, that is Corinth, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace, for he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. Now let's take a few moments and look at these verses, and let's talk about a few essentials to remember in personal discipleship, because What's happening here is one couple decides to take a little bit of time and invest in a guy that, by the way, we're going to find out a guy that from outward appearance has it all together. A guy that from appearance really isn't a guy that needs to be discipled. But they take him aside and they invest in him. And quite frankly, we don't hear much more about this couple. A couple of times they're mentioned later in the New Testament, but not like Apollos. So here are a few essentials to think about in personal discipleship. How do I find someone that I can take and invest my life in along the way? Look at verse 24 once again. Now, a certain Jew named Apollos, that by that name we can believe that he was born probably out of a pagan background, because Apollos is a name attached to pagan gods. He was born at Alexandria. Let me tell you about Alexandria. Alexandria is in northern Africa, and so Apollos is an African. Alexandria was one of the great cities of the world prior to Rome taking power. Prior to the Roman Empire, Alexandria is one of the great cities of the world. Not only that, but it was made the capital of Egypt by the Emperor Ptolemy when Egypt was the empire prior to Rome. It was a culture of Hellenism and Greek-speaking people. It had a very large Jewish population. Alexandria did, probably 10 to 20,000, which in that day was pretty large. It had the largest library in the world at that time, somewhere between 500,000 to 700,000 volumes. And we ain't talking about books like this. We're talking about the scrolls. That's a lot of books. And so it was a center of learning and highly academic and intellectual. Plato came out of Alexandria. No one really knows how Christianity arrived in Alexandria. We just know that Apollos came out of there. So here he is showing up in Ephesus, having been taught the way of Christ to some degree. We're going to find out more about him. It says that not only was he born at Alexandria, but he was an eloquent man, or a learned man. This word means reasoned or a thoughtful, a man who in his reasoning and his thoughts was sharp. He had been trained in terms of what he knows, the information, and was able to use it. He was eloquent. He was an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures. So he had been taught probably through the synagogue, Judaism, and he had been taught at least partially Christianity. We're going to see here in just a moment. Then, and at this point, by the way, you get this picture of this guy. Here's my image of him. Just a good-looking guy. He's all put together. He speaks sharp. He draws people in. When he talks, people just are drawn. You know, there are some people who can just hold crowds, and they just are drawn to them. And not only that, but what he says, it's not just his delivery, but the content is excellent. And that's Apollos. So verse 25, here are a few more things we learn about Apollos. Number one, it says he had been instructed in the way of the Lord. That phrase, way of the Lord, is a phrase that's also used in the Old Testament. So we can assume that his initial instruction was background of Judaism. He was taught about God. He was taught about the people of Israel. And he was, on some level, a Jewish proselyte out of Alexandria. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord. We also see that he was being fervent in spirit. That word fervent means to seethe or to bubble. There are a lot of people out there who have profound amounts of knowledge about a particular topic. And there are other people who have profound passion in speaking about a topic. But when you combine someone who has an amazing amount of knowledge of a topic and yet can passionately speak so that it mesmerizes people about that topic, you have a powerful influence. I don't know how many of you have ever read about or even watched any of the movies about Winston Churchill and all the failures he had, but the one thing he was able to do is take the knowledge of what he knew about world events and combine it with a passion, an ability to just to draw people in and mesmerize them with his speaking. And you had a powerful leader, and many times that's the case. But sometimes you have someone who knows a whole bunch about the material, but their delivery is, oh. He said, Pastor, I had that guy in college. Oftentimes that happens. Maybe an instructor who knows the information incredibly well, but really doesn't kind of have it to put in it. But then, on the other hand, maybe you have someone who's out there with passion about a particular topic, and they're kind of speaking out of passion, but they don't know a whole lot about it. So I think I read a post from that guy on social media yesterday. But anyway, but when you combine those two things, then you have a guy like Apollos, passionate, knowledgeable. And it says he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord. He spoke and taught accurately. Pastor, how accurate was it? Well, it was as accurate as he knew. He spoke accurately about everything that he knew. Just because you hear someone who mesmerizes you with their speaking, who mesmerizes you even with their content, don't assume that everything they say is accurate, or don't assume that what they say is all of the story. And so Priscilla and Aquila were knowledgeable enough. They began to listen to Apollos, and most people were drawn in and mesmerized by, and would have never questioned what he said because he was so powerful in what he did know, and he was so powerful in his delivery. But it says in verse 25, what did he know? Last phrase. Everybody see that? What did he know? Baptism of John. Everybody see that? He knew only the baptism of John. Now, we're going to talk more in just a few moments about what that means. Remember, John the Baptist came into the world. Luke 1, verses 13 through 27, if you want to read this later, in Luke 1. And it was said that he would come to be a forerunner for what? For Jesus. John's whole job was to offer a baptism of repentance to get folks ready for Jesus. John wasn't supposed to be the whole story. John was just supposed to be the preparing for the real story that was to come. How many of you like to get there in time for the movies to watch all the previews? Right? I do. I really do. And now you got previews before the preview. I guess they're not previews. They're cartoons and little short. Listen, if I'm going to pay $146 to go to the movies and buy one tub of popcorn, right? I want to see everything they got to play. And so the movie starts at 7:15. Let's get there at 6:55. Let's go sit down and watch everything they have to do. But what if somebody didn't know? What if they bought their popcorn, bought their drink? Can I ask you all a question? Isn't it kind of disappointing when you finish your popcorn before the movie starts? Okay. Anyway, so what if someone who had never... You all do that, don't you? I do too. You have to get the refillable because we've done finished our popcorn before the movie starts most of the time. You've got to go back out and get some. Who's going to go out and get it? Who's going to miss the first 3 minutes of the movie? So what if someone didn't know and they came in to watch the movie and they got there early and they watched all the previews, finished their popcorn, and go, okay, let's go home. And you never actually saw the movie you came to see. You thought what you saw was it, and it wasn't. Well, that's kind of Apollos. Apollos knew everything right up to Jesus. John the Baptist was sent to be a preview, to be a coming attraction, if you will, and it's going to be Jesus when he shows up. He's going to come. Can I suggest to you that where discipleship is concerned, personal discipleship, can I suggest to you that no one is past assistance? If I had seen Apollos at the time, if you had seen Apollos at the time, we might have thought, this guy, he's got it all together. Ain't no need to train him. He has got it all together. Except you got a couple like Priscilla and Aquila who are so well versed in the Scriptures. Can I suggest to you, no matter who you are or where you are, there's someone around you that could use your time to invest in them. That's one of the things that disappoints me at times about the way, especially where children and teenagers and youth are concerned in their levels in school. Oftentimes we're taught, and this happened when I was a kid. If you're an older kid, you kind of look down on and give a hard time to the younger kids, and you hassle them, and you sure don't hang around with them. If you're a senior in high school, you hack on the freshmen. If you're in elementary school and now it's the fifth grader, back when I was going through, it was sixth grade was in elementary school, but you kind of hack on the younger kids. What would happen? What would happen if some of the older kids decided, you know what? I'm not going to hack on them. I'm going to just come alongside them and help them. I'm going to spend a little bit of time with them. I don't care what my friends say. I don't care if they think I'm weird for hanging around with kids younger than me, because I just want to spend a little bit of time and invest in them. How many of us as children, as teenagers, ever thought about that we could actually use things that we've learned to invest in kids younger than us? I heard a story years ago about a young man, true story, who did that. He decided, as a junior and senior in high school, he was in a kind of a private Christian school, so all the grades were all there on the campus at the same time. He decided he was going to take some of his free time and invest back in some of the middle and elementary schoolers. And they said some of his friends kind of made fun of him for hanging around younger kids. They gave him a hard time. And they said this guy became so popular among those younger kids that when he graduated, he would from time to time come back on campus, and now those kids are in middle and high school that he invested in, and they would just flood around him because they loved him. I'm just saying. We come to church week in and week out. And have you ever taken the time when you come on this campus to think, is there anybody on this campus who might just be able to use my encouragement? Maybe it's not knowledge, maybe it's encouragement. Maybe it's Bible knowledge, or maybe it's just knowledge on how to fix a car or clean a house. There is someone here who could use your time and your effort and your investment. Someone. Probably more than one, but at least someone, and no one is past assistance. Look at verse 26. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. So here's Apollos knowing only the baptism of John. But bless God, God bless Apollos. What he did know, he was going to give it to you with all he had, both barrels. Because that's who he was. He was passionate and he was effective. And people were just blown away, right? Except Aquila and Priscilla. They heard him. They took him aside. There are a lot of ways to correct someone who may be teaching inaccurately. But there's only one or two really good ways to do it. Standing at the back door and criticizing the speaker in front of everybody else, that ain't the way. I'm not saying that's happened to me. Well, it has happened to me. Actually, not here. I've had places where it's happened. It's almost like I can picture when I was a young pastor, I was 23, 24, 25 years old, and honestly, I didn't know much. It's no wonder I didn't have that happen a lot more often. I probably got things wrong all the time. And I'll never forget standing in the back of the church one day, and a guy who was probably 20 years older than me. It was almost like he couldn't wait to get out of church to confront me at the back door. It was embarrassing. I was a young pastor. It was embarrassing, and, but what could I do? He was right. In the information he gave me, I was inaccurate. I came back the next week. I corrected it. I told him I was wrong, and we went on about it. But there was a better way for him to do it. I'm not saying I learned something. But I love the fact that Aquila and Priscilla, they didn't just have the information. They cared about Apollos. If you think going to someone and calling them out in front of other people is somehow a biblical thing, unless it's some public issue that needs to be addressed. But if you're talking about just inaccuracy or correction, if you think calling them out in front of people is the way to go, then you don't care about them. You care about looking good and being right and letting your voice be known. Or otherwise, you would pull them aside, you would come to their office, you would take them aside, and you would sit down and talk to them. Priscilla and Aquila could have easily stood up in that synagogue and said, "Brother, you're wrong. You are inaccurate." And they had the information, and they could have proven him wrong, but they wouldn't do that. You know why they wouldn't do it? Because they cared about Apollos. They cared about him. And so he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately, more perfectly, more adequately. It's a more accurate or exact. They just wanted what he taught to be more precise. And so are you ready? Where personal discipleship is concerned, not only is no one past assistance, personal discipleship requires personal action. It requires personal action. I remember when Ellison and I first got married, the first church we visited was the church we became a part of. And it was funny because prior to going to that church, we talked about, we said, we're going to visit several churches and kind of see what the Lord has for us. And it was funny, we visited this one church and we never left. You know why? There are a lot of reasons. But one of the major reasons we never left is we visited a Sunday school class. It was a young couple's Sunday school class, and we were very young, 20 and 21 years old. And we went into that class, and there was a couple there that were 12, 13, 14 years our senior. And they were the teachers of the Sunday school class, and they were very good about their Sunday school class kind of getting together outside of the building. By the way, here's a little note, if you will, that is an aside from this message. If you're a Sunday school teacher, Sunday school leader, Sunday school class, finding opportunities to meet outside of the class is going to make your class so much more effective along the way. That's just a personal public service announcement. Anyway, so they did that. They did that. And we would get together outside of class, and they told us kind of their calling was to invest in young couples who came into their class. But for whatever reason, God had put Alyssa and I on their hearts especially. And I've shared this story here before, but it is so relevant to this message, I had to share it again. So some of you may be even familiar with this story. And they just began to invest in us. Well, Pastor Johnny, what do you mean by investing? Did they sit you down and teach you every Saturday night? No, they just got together with us. We would go to their house and watch a movie, or we'd go out to eat. We'd go to their house and watch, and they had young kids, and they didn't tell us how to raise children. We just watched them raise children along the way. And I cannot begin to tell you how many things that we've learned through the years as a married couple that we can connect back to that couple who just took time to invest in us. And it was very personal along the way. There's someone, folks, that you can invest in. Maybe it's as simple as making sure this individual can get a ride to church. If not, maybe you're their ride. Pastor, if so-and-so can't get a ride to church, do we have somebody who can pick them up? Yes, you. If that's someone you know of, then God's probably put them on your heart. That's probably who's supposed to pick them up. Could that help just simply be by reaching out and inviting them to lunch or breakfast or coffee? Maybe nothing more than that. Just spend a little bit of time together, developing a relationship. Maybe it's inviting a young couple to your house, older couples. Say, hey, come over and have dinner with us. Most young couples are going to say, hey, man, if we don't have to buy food and cook, I'm good with that. And just spend some time with them. I could go on and on and on. But there's someone here to which you could put personal attention to. And look at verse 27, 28. And when they desired to cross to Achaia, or when he desired to cross to... Now, so Apollos has been in Ephesus. He's been in the synagogue. He's been taught more thoroughly. At this point, you say, well, how did he only know the baptism of John? Well, there are things that happen in the book of Acts that are kind of unique to the way it happens today. Today, when you get saved, you get saved. There aren't folks walking around just knowing the baptism of John who are truly saved today. But in the book of Acts, you're going from Old Covenant to New Covenant. Pre-Pentecost, post-Pentecost. And there are 2 or 3 situations that unique things happen that are never repeated again in the epistles. This is one of them. It's a guy who just happens to know the baptism of John, but I think he's a Christian, and he just needed a little more accurate teaching, and he got that. Now he leaves, and he wants to go from Ephesus, if you remember the map, and go back west to Achaia, that is Corinth. Apollos is going to go to Corinth. He wanted to go there. The brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. They sent him letters of reference, if you will, letters of introduction. And when he arrived, watch this, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace in Corinth now. You know, Paul's in Antioch, Priscilla and Aquila are in Ephesus. Now Apollos is going back to Corinth, for he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. Watch this. you really don't know if that person you're investing in will end up in some greatly powerful application. And that brings me to this point. Personal discipleship can result in powerful application. Powerful application. How powerful was the application of Priscilla and Aquila investing in Apollos? How about this? By the time 1 Corinthians is written, it's a couple of decades later, by the time 1 Corinthians is written, Paul begins to address the Corinthians because they're divided, right? Some of you may know that there's this division among the Corinthians. Part of their division is that they were gathering up sides. They had particular people that they liked best, and so they were kind of going to that person's side. It would be likened here to one person saying, well, I'm a Pastor Johnny guy, and another person saying, I'm a Pastor Micah guy, and dividing up among leaders, which we would never allow to happen, but sometimes that happens in churches. It was happening in Corinth. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, some of you Corinthians are saying, I am of Paul, the great apostle. Some of you are saying, I am of Cephas, Peter. And he even says, and some of you are saying, I am of Apollos. So by the time 1 Corinthians was written, they were viewing Apollos on the same level as Paul and Peter. Could Priscilla and Aquila ever have imagined the impact of just simply investing a little bit in someone else? They could never have imagined that. And neither can you. You can't possibly imagine what would come out of simply investing your life in someone to the glory of God. You can't, you don't know. There was a man years ago, born early in the 20th century. His name was Malcolm. And as he grew up, his father was killed when he was very young. He was from Nebraska. His mother was institutionalized when he was 13. By the time he was 20, he had been through multiple foster homes, and he was in prison as a 20-year-old young man. While in prison, he was befriended by an older prisoner who was a very religious, spiritual man who began to invest in Malcolm. And by the time Malcolm came out of prison, he had completely changed. One of the great public speakers and preachers of the 20th century. You may know Malcolm as Malcolm X. One of the great civil rights leaders of the 20th century, but he did it all under out of the discipleship of a man named John Bembry in prison, but he did it all under the auspices of Islam. And I have often thought, what if a guy came along in prison like John Bembry, who was a born-again believer, and had invested that in a young man who was lost, like Malcolm Little was before he became Malcolm X? We would have had two Martin Luther King Jr.'s, both preaching the gospel and promoting civil rights. As it was, Malcolm X did some great things for the civil rights movement, but it was done all under the flag of Islam. Ladies and gentlemen, you simply have no idea what kind of impact it can make if you invest your life in another individual. The potential impact of properly and thoroughly discipling someone is immense. I've got a friend that I've gotten to know this past year. His name is Tyrone Street. Tyrone Street is his name. I've got some pictures that I want to show up here because I want to show you Tyrone. This is Tyrone right here. This is his brother. They're twins, by the way. This is Tyrone and his wife. This is his brother. His brother coaches, is really involved in travel baseball up in the McDonough area. Tyrone, some of you may have seen him. He's the assistant manager at the Walmart Neighborhood Marketplace on North Houston Drive, North Houston Road. The reason I bring him up is because of this. He and I got to talking, and he told me about when he was growing up. His parents got divorced when he was a child, and he and his twin brother were shuttled back and forth between his parents' house, between relatives' houses. His mother, I guess out of the impact of it, began to do drugs and became a heavy drug addict, and they shifted back and forth between Griffin and Columbus, between their houses, and then between other family. And he said by the time they hit high school, he and his brother decided that they were going to live with their father because their mother just simply was not capable of taking care of them, and they were going to be taken into social services if something didn't change. And Tyrone told me this. He said, Pastor, we went to live with my dad, and because we were teenagers, we were going into high school, we didn't really want to live with him because he had too many rules, and my mom didn't. She was barely able to take care of herself. And I've gotten permission to tell this story from him. I asked his permission. He said, but when we got to my dad's house, he was a lot more strict. He said, Tyrone said, we had to go to morning school, which was like school from 6:30 to 8 before school started just to catch up. So we finally caught up in school. He said, but along the way, my brother and I just were involved in sports and athletics. He said, we loved to play baseball. He said, but I got involved also in junior ROTC. He said, there was a man who was a sergeant in the junior ROTC at Griffin High School. Sergeant McRae was his name, and I want to read you a quote from Tyrone. He said, there was a Sergeant McRae in the junior ROTC who began to show me how being with the wrong people could cause me trouble. He helped me to see how hard work, discipline, and staying focused could really change my life. These were things I had heard from my dad, but with all the upheaval in my life, I probably didn't listen very well. When Sergeant McRae told me the same things, I really took it seriously. He had a huge impact on my life. And Tyrone told me about how he came to know the Lord, how he found him a job after high school at a local Walmart, how he's advanced up through the corporation. He's still a young man now, and I have no reason to think he won't continue to advance, simply because one man at one time took a little time to invest in Tyrone, and the investment Sergeant McRae made really wasn't a spiritual investment. Imagine what happens if not only you make an investment on someone on life skills, but you also make a spiritual investment. Ladies and gentlemen, the potential impact of personal discipleship can be immense. And I'm just asking today, how many of you would say, Pastor Johnny, I've been prayerfully looking for someone, or I've got someone I just want to spend some time with. I mean, don't overwhelm them. Maybe it's for the first time. Maybe it's just a matter of checking to make sure they have a ride to church. Maybe someone who has missed church and you know they're not here, you just check on them and make sure they have a ride. And maybe you're that ride, and maybe that's where a relationship begins. Maybe it's a young couple. You as an older couple, you're like, we don't have a lot to teach, but maybe we can at least teach all the things not to do. I tell that a lot. I can tell you a lot about things not to do, if nothing else. What happens if, as a church, we collectively begin to look for people in whom we can invest? Pastor, but I'm only in 5th grade. I'm only in 6th grade. I'm only in 8th grade. There's someone younger than you and someone not quite as far along as you. And what happens if you just say hello to them? Hey, how's it going? How was school this week? What happens if all you do when you get to church, you find them, how was school this week? Did you do good at school? And you encourage them. Maybe it's as simple as that. But you begin to invest your life in someone. What happens? God knows. I'm telling you, the potential impact is enormous. And I want to ask you today, are you that person? Are you here today and say, Pastor, I don't really have anything to invest because I've never been born again. I don't really have anything spiritual to invest. And maybe today's your day to come and say, Pastor, can you explain to me how to be born again? And we'll let you talk with someone. But maybe you're praying about having someone in whom to invest. And maybe you want to come down front this morning and pray for them. Just say, Lord, help me to know how I can begin to invest in this person. Maybe you're saying, I've really never thought about it, Pastor, but I don't know, it makes sense. Maybe you want to come and pray, Lord, help me. Lord, put someone across my path. Put someone in my sight that in whom I can begin to invest. I'll tell you this. One thing I've experienced in my life is all the times I've wanted to feel sorry for myself, all the times I've wanted to be angry at a situation, all the times I've wanted to be lonely or feel like no one can relate. When I turn around, when I begin to invest in someone else, those feelings of self just kind of disappear. You cannot invest in someone else and stay selfish. And maybe that's your time. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to stand. I'm going to invite you just to respond as the Lord leads. Father, right now in Jesus' name, help us to obey you in these moments. You stand right where you are.